Making it last is all I care to do. You loving me, I loving you. Mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, friends for life, won't live in the past. All I wanna do now is making it last. Mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, friends forever, strengthening the ties that keep us together.
It's time for another conversation. Welcome to Making It Last podcast. I'm your host, Noreen Dealer. It's all about helping us to have better relationships, not just with ourselves, but with other people. And it's interesting because we're dealing with the first part of that tagline today, which is the relationship with self. Welcome, Kamini.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
We're speaking with Kamini Wood. She's a professional certified coach based in the United States of America. And I noticed on the phone call, North Carolina came up on my phone. So we're going to be talking about how is self developed and maintained. And for somebody who probably missed the previous episode, Kamini, just tell them what is self.
Self is how we see ourselves, how we talk to ourselves, how we truly show up in our own being, releasing the need for external validation or external definition of who we are.
Okay. All right. So how is this self developed? Let's deal with it developed part and then the maintained afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
How is this developed?
So very interestingly, I think originally ourselves, we develop it from an external source, right? Because we're children, we look to our parents for direction. They feed us, almost this definition of self. Then, of course, as we get older, it's influenced by school, it's influenced by friends, by society. And really, I think what ends up happening as we become adults is some of us do struggle with this idea of, well, who am I outside of the definition of others? And that's where the gold is. It's about developing your own identity for yourself. So it's about releasing the definition of quote unquote who you should be, and it's who you really are. And it's so important to find what your values are, what your core gifts are, because that's what makes you uniquely you.
You said develop your own identity. Is this something that you think happens at maybe a specific age or stage of one's life?
I do think that identity is something that is kind of consistently evolving, because as we grow, as we age, as we have experiences, it consistently evolves itself.
Mm-hmm.
I do think that our identity when we're at an early age is defined by those around us, by our parental figures, by our familial relationship, again, society, friends, that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
As we get older, it just becomes something that we define for ourselves. I know from my personal experience, I as you mentioned, I'm in the States. I was first generation American. However, my parents were immigrants. And I know for me, identity was an interesting thing growing up, because I had my Indian culture as the predominant, guidelines in my home life. And of course, when I went to school, there was again, I'm using quotes here, the American culture. So it was a different culture. And it was this, how do you find that balance for yourself? And so that in my own story, that was an interesting evolution of, well, who really am I? Because I'm not, when I'm in with the Indian culture and people of the Indian culture, they looked at me funny because, for instance, I didn't have the same accent, but yet when I was with the people around me growing up, I was darker skinned, for instance. So I didn't look like them. I had darker hair, darker skin. So it wasn't, you weren't quite that identity either. So as a young child, that was a little bit of an issue of like, okay, well, how do I define myself? And so that's what I'm talking about with identity, is eventually you come into this place of recognizing that you can define that for yourself because you are uniquely you. And when we can start to accept and value who we are based on our value system, based on our own core gifts, that's when we're truly coming to this concept of self.
I know you've been enjoying the conversation, but we're going to take a little break and get a word from our sponsor.
Photography is an art, but more so, photography must come from the heart. Precious moments, priceless times. Take a pic and know it will turn out fine. For beautiful captures, email us at bmcphotographyja@gmail.com or call us at 876-350-7089. BMC Photography JA. Beautiful moments captured.
You said earlier the whole idea of that, your identity or evolves. So do you think that, let me use myself as an example. There are some people who I went to school with, whether primary school or high school, and I won't see them for a while, and 10, 20 plus years after, we will see each other and they'll say, "Oh, but Noreen, you haven't changed." And in my mind, I'm going, huh? So sometimes I think that's a good thing. Sometimes I'm not so sure. So do you think that is as if they're just some core elements, so to speak, of self that really, really don't change?
That's a really good point. I actually think that there are some elements. Look, I don't think that our value system, the core values, I don't think that they really change.
Okay.
I think that they just grow. They grow a little bit or maybe shift ever so slightly.
Mm-hmm.
But who we are as people, like our deep down core being, that doesn't shift.
Okay.
Our being is who exactly we are.
Okay. Which I think is a nice segue then to talk about how it's self-maintained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really what happens, I think, as we go through life and we start to interact with others is, a lot of times we lose track of who we are. We lose track of checking in with ourselves. How do I feel about something?
Mm-hmm.
What do I need in this situation? And so how do we maintain that sense of self is really taking stock of things like that, asking ourselves routinely, how do I feel right now and what do I need? Because when we can recognize those things, we are maintaining our own self-care and we're maintaining our own identity of self in those instances. It's when we start losing track of that we start building the foundations for things like codependency, for instance, which is a complete loss of self, right? When we are codependent on somebody else, our own identity gets muddled with theirs. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's really about when we say how do we maintain it, it's really making sure that we're checking in with ourselves routinely. And I do think that oftentimes when we start getting busy with life, it's very easy to end up on autopilot and
Mm-hmm.
forgetting to do that very important part.
How then do you treat what I'm going to refer to as the unseen sides of self? Because, people sometimes see things in you that you don't even see in yourself.
That's a great question. I actually think that a lot of times we don't want to see those things. And so sometimes the real way to deal with that is to start just becoming curious. A lot of times we want to just run away and suppress things that we don't want to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
I always say, sometimes we need to put on our scientist hat and our observer hat and just say, that's a curious thing that they've noticed about me. When and where does it seem to appear? And maybe just get curious with what they're noticing, because sometimes those things that we don't want to see are things that we're actually suppressing. And if we can bring it to the awareness, we can actually decide, is this something that serves me? Is this something that's true to myself? Or is this something that I just need to release and let go of?
We're talking about the whole idea of self, but in terms of our relationships, how because there's some people that might think that if it is that you're spending so much time on developing self and maintaining self, then you might then have a disconnect with everybody else, or it might actually help you to be a better person in your relationship. So how do you strike that balance? Because I think with anything you can go to the extreme.
Well, sure. I mean, if you become, the idea of maintaining a relationship with self is not an element of self-centeredness, right?
Okay.
We're not saying that we discount somebody else in the relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But my perspective is if we don't have that really solid foundation of sense of self, when we get involved in a relationship with others, it's the breeding ground to create codependency. Because what happens is and toxicity. Because what happens is when we don't really truly know who we are or what our feelings and needs are,
Mm-hmm.
we end up then being indifferent to the other person. And that's when we start losing and we start ending up in that codependent relationship. And truthfully, what we're really striving for is an interdependent one, where each one of us has our own identity. And then, of course, there's the piece of us that overlap, which becomes the us. That's that interdependence. When we are codependent, we're losing our own selves. We lose ourselves in each other, and we can't actually function without the other person. And that's what happens when we don't have that solid foundation of relationship with self.
If there's somebody who's listening and feeling like, but I'm in my 50s and I'm in my 60s and I'm still to some extent, as sad as it might sound, still trying to find me, and I think that is why sometimes when people leave certain relationships after such an extended period, people probably wonder how come. But I'm thinking, and I could be speculating, that sometimes it is that they just decided, hey, this is just not serving me anymore. I don't think this is best for me. So, for somebody who is listening and saying, I'm still struggling with that, ladies, I don't know. It's probably taking longer than it should. And I do want to develop that strong sense of self and then maintain it. But then sometimes my environment is not necessarily encouraging that. What could you say to that person to encourage them on this journey to selfhood?
Well, the first thing I would say is that each one of us has our own timeline. There's no predefined timeline as to you need to find yourself by a certain date. It's all about whatever is your timeline first and foremost. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is, there's no harm in finding yourself at any given point in time. And it's true. I mean, I have clients who are in their 50s who come to me and they recognize that they've lost their own sense of self because they've been defined by the roles that they've been playing throughout the previous years. First they were a daughter, then they were, a student, then they were a wife, and then they were a mother, and then they were an employee, and they completely were on autopilot for all those years. Nobody's at fault for then saying, you know what? I need to realign. I need to realign with myself. No matter when we have that awakening, it's perfectly right for us. And there is no judgment as to you should have known sooner. It's about, but now, and you're willing to do the work now to really heal that relationship with yourself. And that's really what matters.
I know you've been enjoying the conversation, but we're going to take a little break and get a word from our sponsor. So, the whole idea of a branding strategy sounded so exotic and so fancy to me. But after having several conversations with Neon, I now have a clearer understanding. I am sure of what my identity is, what it is that I want people to see Noreen Daly as. Thanks, Neon. Thanks, Splint. Visit them at wearesplint.com. If as we're wrapping up, if there's somebody who's still somewhat skeptical about all that's been said, what's the one thing you'd want them to leave, this conversation with? If they got nothing else, this is it.
Yeah. The one thing would be that their unique self is this gift that the world needs. We do not need to be carbon copies of each other. And so just truly, truly honoring who they are as a person is the one thing that I would want them to take away from this conversation.
Thanks so much, Kamini. I have a feeling that we're going to be having other conversations. I love your energy. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much.
This was Making It Last podcast. I'm your host, Noreen Daly. It's all about helping us to have better relationships, not just with ourselves, but with other people. Until next time.
Making it last is all I care to do. You loving me, I loving you. and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, friends for life, won't live in the past. All I wanna do now is making it last.